Just here in my garage. Just bought this shipment of lumber behind me. It's fun to build with in the Hollywood Hills. But you know what I care about a lot more than just materialistic things? Knowledge. In fact, I'm much more proud of the thousands of different descriptions and different inputs that you can get on Describe. See, Describe allows you to go through so many different descriptions when you're unprepared and gives you the knowledge that you need to improvise in D&D. Not only that, for every single description that you find, there's going to be an ambience in the sonic sound library, which allows you to immediately play music or sound effects that are needed for the situation. Knowledge is much more important, and I don't know how long I can keep up the stupid parody. So check the discount below for an amazing ability to get the best possible descriptions at your table and an amazing deal for ambiances and different sounds that you may need for your game.
I'm sure the last thing you would expect when talking about a really effective villain is Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Or at least I'm sure you would have thought that several weeks ago, but at this point, who hasn't made a video on him? But the thing that I've noticed is that there's one crucial thing that's missing, and that's the effect that Death actually had in order to describe the character of the movie itself. See, the villain is almost as crucial to the story as the main character when it comes to exploring the themes of the narrative. When you try and figure out exactly what you want to do with the story, the villain is there to add contrast to what the hero is trying to overcome. And I think that is exactly what happens in Puss in Boots. See, the story itself is actually fascinating and pretty much your very typical D&D campaign. I mean, seriously, imagine a group of eclectic weirdos going on an adventure trying to achieve this MacGuffin at the end of the road while fighting weird villains that constantly pop up, creating the most strange adventure possible. I mean, really, it's kind of the perfect idea for that kind of campaign. And yet, somehow, the villain itself is perfect. In fact, Puss in Boots theoretically has 3 villains. It has Jack Horner, it has Goldilocks and the 3 bears, and then there's Death. Death always waiting in the background, but somehow Death is different. And I think it is one of the most amazing narrative tools I've ever seen, and is perfect for any story so long as you understand what made it so effective in the first place. See, I mentioned a moment ago that it's important to have a good villain for contrast with the hero, and this is true. Many times in a story, the hero is contrasted by the villain because the villain personifies the very thing the hero needs to overcome in order to learn their lesson in the story. But in this particular story, it is a hard-hitting one that could go with anybody, that could really hit home with literally any character or any person, because Death waits for us all. It is part of the human condition, or in this case, the cat condition. The point is, there's always going to be death at the end of the road, which makes this villain infinitely understandable to anybody you can ever discuss. There are even characters out there who are immortal, and yet death is still crucial to their story.
I'll give you anything! Money, fame, riches, infinite power, your own galaxy, please! No! What's happening to me?
Because the end of a life is the ultimate question that every person who lives has to ask themselves. And so death is such a perfect example of a villain. But you have to take a step back and ask yourself, is Death a villain? See, this story is pretty much driven by death. At the beginning of the story, we see the fearless Puss in Boots, the legend himself. Fearful of nothing, laughs in the face of death, will go into any danger with a broad smile on his face and a song in his heart. Until the end. See, near the beginning of the story, we realize that Puss is on his last life. Cats only have 9 lives, and he has gone through 8, meaning that there's only 1 life left for him to live. And he's in denial about this. He is insistent that he is Puss in Boots. He laughs in the face of death. But does he? Because death comes knocking. Or should I say, whistling. The point is, death shows up, and Puss realizes very suddenly, death is real. Death is imminent. Death is in front of him, and death is the end. And that is something that any character, any person could truly embody and understand. We all wonder what death is like, and we all fear for what it means. Because see, you'll hear people talk about the fact that the perfect way to create fear in a story is to leave it unknown. Nothing is more terrifying than the human emotions and natures and imagination that lives within our head. So therefore, if you leave it alone, we, as humans, as people, will inevitably make the villain more terrifying than it actually is. But what is the perfect, actual end conclusion of that concept? Well, death is the ultimate unknown. There is not a single person who knows what's beyond that horizon. Even those who are confident in their own religion or anything still wonder. There's always that doubt because you do not have a firm conclusion. I've talked with people before who have been very confident that they know where they're going after their death because their religion tells them so. But ultimately, do they? Because nobody has been able to confirm that for them. They've admitted that yes, they believe this on faith, but faith comes without knowing. Death is terrifying. And so as Puss faces this and realizes that this is real death, as we see this wolf swing for him and blood begins to come trickling down, it is a sign of his own mortality, and he realizes, I only have one life left. What else could I possibly do? This is why I think death is the perfect type of villain for your story, because it will force the main characters to have to understand something that they cannot escape. That is the ultimate point of this entire story. Death cannot be escaped, and Puss must face this down over and over and over again. And if you were to put this concept in your story, I don't think it's anything new or fascinating, because yeah, every single story deals with death. Every time we see an action movie where somebody is trying to escape a dangerous situation, where we see Bond trying to escape a trap, where we see that action hero fighting against the main villain, the thing we're worried about is death. That's what they're trying to fight against. They're trying not to die. Death is in every story. Death will be in every story. In a romance, in a tragedy, in a comedy, it's going to be there because it's part of living. It's part of life. But the idea of creating this personified version of it that stares down a hero, somebody who's supposed to laugh in the face of death, a hero we're supposed to root for, that is what would create a truly horrifying villain for the main characters to have to overcome. And I think the most fascinating thing about this character is it forces Puss, it forces whatever main character has to come against it, to ask themselves, what does death mean to them? And this is the thing that I think really, really nails down how horrifying this villain is it forces Puss to ask a question, and I haven't seen anybody talk about this yet. It forces Puss to ask a question of what death means to him, and more importantly, what it means if death is right. See, here's the funny thing I haven't seen mentioned a lot in the discourse on this movie, and that's the fact that death forces Puss to ask a very specific question, and it's one that we must all ask ourselves, but we don't want to. See, over the course of this entire movie, we've seen Puss grapple with the fact that he was immortal, invincible. He had 8 lives, now they're all gone. But there's a moral battle being fought between death and Puss. See, death is this inevitable force of nature. It comes for everybody. So it's weird that there would be a moral battle, but there is. Because in order to accept that death will be here, Puss is going to have to accept the fact that he wasted 8 lives. He wasted everything he's ever done. And it leads to this ultimate question that we are all terrified to ask ourselves. Have we done what we needed to in our lives? See, that's a horrifying question to ask, and it leads to this inevitable dread, not just because death is coming, but there is this strange, unavoidable dread that sits on our shoulders, asking ourselves, have I wasted my life? But Puss has wasted 8. And this is where I think that death is the perfect foil for any single character. This personification of death could be put into any story and could add on to it, whether it be a comedy or a romance or anything, because there is never going to be a time where it is a bad idea to have a character reflect on who they are and whether they've done what they want to. And you'll find that in almost every story there is out there, that moment will come regardless, whether there is a personification of death in the story or not. If you were to take The Odyssey, or you were to take Love Actually, The Lighthouse, it doesn't matter. Every single character at some point must reflect upon themselves and wonder if what they've done up to this point is correct. It is part of being human, of living, so if we're going to create a realistic character, we must do this. And yes, at some point I'm being a little overdramatic about this, and I have to accept that. If you were to take a kid's show and ask if Clifford has reflected on death, probably not. Maybe. Is there an episode where Clifford reflects on death? That's not the point. The point is, every character who is fully fleshed out and realized will at some point have to look at themselves and ask themselves, am I what I need to be? And that is what this character does. That is what death does. And it is so fascinating watching in this simple animated DreamWorks movie, a character being forced to come to that conclusion. A character who has wasted 8 lives, only has 1 left, and then we get to the final battle, which is where I think I would just be so excited to introduce this concept to a story I was creating. To have the main characters, to have the characters have to face this down, stare at this villain, and ask themselves, is this something I'm willing to accept? Am I willing to accept that death will always come? There is no escaping. And will I embrace it? Will I embrace the one life I have left to live? And you know what? This goes beyond storytelling. This goes into every single person's personal lives. Are we willing to accept that we only have one life left to live? Are we willing to accept what we've done? And most importantly, are we willing to accept what we're going to do next? Is what we've done in this life enough, or are we going to go forward and do something more? Can we do more? And if we can't, what do we need to do to get there? Are we hopeless? I hope not. But death waits for us all. And what are we gonna do about it? It's funny because this seems like this existential dread we would never be able to escape, but watching Puss in Boots, I felt elated, excited. I watched the main character accept that this was going to happen, but he had one life, and he wasn't going to let it go. He wasn't going to let this go out the wind. He was going to live that life. And that just fills me with a certain sense of genuine appreciation. I think this character, Death, is a perfect villain for any story because it forces the character to reflect upon themselves. And reflecting upon yourself will always create a more interesting character because it creates a more realistic character. Because we must all reflect on ourselves at one point in life. And I truly believe that's what's going to create the best story possible. So ultimately, what do you think? Has there ever been a situation where death has been presented in a personification of a character or not to your character that forced you to have to reconsider what it is they were doing, how they felt about life? Have you ever had to sit there and face down that mirror and decide what your character lived for? And ultimately, what you lived for? Because I think it's a fascinating question. And it does bring a little bit of existential dread, but also hope that the next step that we can take may be the better one.